He wasn't well known at the time. He was 49 years old, 6'2", and the governor of Maryland. His name was Spiro Agnew, a politician from the Old Line state. Richard Nixon had just nominated him for vice president. Delegates were bewildered and astonished by this decision, including one delegate who said he didn't even know who Agnew was. However, the Democrats were laughing. Yep, that's it. It just continues. Continuous laughter with words that read, Agnew for vice president? It was an odd decision, but sort of intriguing at the time. It took a while for Nixon to make his decision, but when he did, he was pretty confident. The year was 1968. There was turmoil, violence, protest, and chaos taking place all over the nation. I'm your host, Jeremiah Patterson, and this is Disgrace. Disgrace is a podcast about Watergate and corruption at the top echelons of the federal government. On this episode, I'll be talking about the 1968 presidential election. Stick around. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. It is 100% free. There is creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right here in the app. Anchor will distribute your podcast to all the other podcasting platforms, including the big ones like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast here on Anchor by asking your listeners to donate money. And also, when your listeners listen to ads, you will make money yourself as a podcaster. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. No extra equipment required. You don't even need a microphone. You can just record at your phone. So download the free Anchor app today or get started at anchor.fm/start. Once again, that is anchor.fm/start. In 1968, Richard Nixon and the incumbent president, Lyndon B. Johnson, were the main presidential candidates. The nation was in turmoil. We were in the Vietnam War. Civil rights was in peril, and racial inequality was still transpiring. It got to the point where it was so bad that LBJ stunned the nation when he made this announcement.
With America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
The president had capitulated. He could no longer handle it. The nation was in crisis. Richard Nixon, on the other hand, was crushing his Democratic opponents in primaries and in the polls. Following LBJ's announcement, the country mourned the death of Martin Luther King.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
It was astonishing. One of the nation's greatest and most influential civil rights activists had been gunned down at a motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was known for his preaching and inspirational speeches, and also his pushing for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Dr. King was only 39 years old. He left behind his wife and 4 children. Among those running in the 1968 presidential election was Robert Kennedy. The 42-year-old was the brother of the charming, inspirational, and recently assassinated 35th president. His decision to run for president was quite remarkable, but he received lots of criticism for it. However, some looked at him as maybe we could get another Kennedy in the White House. Here's a CBS News special report on March 16, 1968.
Good morning. We are broadcasting this morning the announcement of Democratic Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York that he will be a candidate for the presidency. The senator is doing so in the face of almost solid opposition from the Democratic Party professionals and the state chairman of the Democratic Party in this country. Only 3 state chairmen, New York, Oregon, and Tennessee, have come out in favor of Mr. Kennedy's candidacy.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies. I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course, and because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, and I feel that I'm obliged to do all that I can. I run to seek new policies, policies to end the bloodshed in Vietnam and in our cities, policies to close the gaps that now exist between black and white, between rich and poor, between young and old, in this country and around the rest of the world. I run for the presidency because I want the Democratic Party and the United States of America to stand for hope instead of despair, for reconciliation of men instead of the growing risk of world war.
Those inspirational words of Bobby Kennedy was part of what he wanted to achieve in office. He wanted to change the nation for the better, bring our troops back home, and move towards a more optimistic future. So here come the primaries, and also, obviously, the political ads.
What has Richard Nixon ever done for you?
What has Richard Nixon ever done for me? Medicare. No, that was Humphrey's idea. But Nixon. What, the bomb? The nuclear bomb? No, it was Humphrey's idea to stop testing the bomb. But Nixon. Now, what has Richard Nixon ever done for me? Let's see. Working people, I'm a worker. Nixon ever do anything? No. Humphrey and the Democrats gave us Social Security. But Nixon. Nothing in education. Nothing in housing. He hasn't done anything there either.
The preceding has been a paid political announcement by Citizens for Humphrey Muskie.
Think about it. When the decisions of one man can affect the future of your family for generations to come, what kind of a man do you want making those decisions? Think about it. Who is the one man who has the experience and the qualifications to lead America in these troubled, dangerous times? Nixon's the one.
The summer of 1968 was a turbulent time in American history. The Vietnam War was still happening and anti-war movements were all over the nation. Dr. Martin Luther King had been assassinated, which caused riots and violence. President Lyndon B. Johnson had announced that he wasn't running for a second term, and chaos was unfolding everywhere. So 1968 was not a good year, nor was it for the Democrats in the presidential election. However, there was some hope after Bobby Kennedy had won the California Democratic primary. Kennedy was incredible. He was in line to be the Democrats' nominee and ultimately face off against Nixon in the general election. Things were looking great for the young candidate until this devastating event transpired.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible? Is that possible? It could. Is it possible, ladies and gentlemen? It is possible. He has. Not only Senator Kennedy. Oh, my God. Senator Kennedy has been shot.
That was an ABC News reporter back in 1968 covering the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. It was spontaneous and astonishing. One of the lead Democratic presidential candidates had just been assassinated. The Republicans' presidential candidate was performing remarkably well. This led to the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, Ohio in 1968.
In 1968, when the Republicans meet in Miami Beach, Richard Milhouse Nixon has come out of retirement, swept to victory in a number of presidential primaries, and is now the first ballot nominee of his party.
The next president of the United States, Richard Nixon.
Tonight, I again proudly accept that nomination for President of the United States.
Hey guys, I have two other podcasts. The other one is called The Jeremiah Patterson Show, where I discuss news, politics, and history, and the other podcast is about U.S. presidents, where I discuss our nation's presidents from 1 through 44 and provide you an intrinsically valuable piece of history. Thanks for listening. Let's get back to the show. The 1968 Democratic Convention was held in Chicago, and it was a disaster.
There have been some demonstrations at this early hour in downtown Chicago's Grant Park. We heard a moment ago that tear gas has been used as the demonstrators are attempting to form a line of parade and march toward or on the amphitheater.
Some of the demonstration leaders saying, keep your cool.
Well, I should think, David, what we've seen requires no comment. It's just unpleasant. Go ahead.
No, you're good. I have nothing further to say about it.
Protest, violence, and chants of the whole world is watching. In fact, it got so bad that the National Guard was called in. But this is 1968, right? I mean, all kinds of things had happened. The nation was in turmoil and the Democratic Party was divided. Just a month after President Johnson made his astonishing announcement that he wasn't going to run for re-election, Vice President Hubert Humphrey decided to spontaneously hop in the race, with the endorsement of the incumbent president. Humphrey had a goal, or perhaps a strategy in mind. He would only campaign in non-primary states, while Kennedy and McCarthy campaigned hard in primary states. However, the race tragically turned upside down after the death of Robert Kennedy transpired. After Kennedy died, his delegates were divided between two other candidates who were in the race, which were McCarthy and the dark horse candidate Senator George McGovern, leaving Humphrey with more than enough delegates to clinch the Democratic nomination.
Mr. Chairman, my fellow Americans, my fellow Democrats, I proudly accept the nomination of our party
The convention was a disaster, a face-off between law enforcement and protesters. There was also chaos inside, where some delegates opposed Humphrey for president.
I think Ed Newman's microphone got broken in that melee. And
this is John Chancellor on the floor. I'm looking down at Edwin Newman in the middle of a huge bunch of security people. How this got started, we don't know. Your microphone is broken, Ed. There's a lot of pushing. The man being pushed, watch it, they're going to knock that over. The man is a delegate.
You just leave him in here. Check with our state chairman. He's an elected delegate. What are you trying to strong-arm stuff? He's an elected delegate. You are. Check with the delegate. Where are the rules that say we must show him every minute? Who the hell are you?
Are you the one they're trying to throw out?
Yes, I am.
Why are they trying to throw you out?
I object to their behavior.
You beg your pardon?
I object to their behavior. Secret Service.
Joel Achenbach from the Washington Post writes, quote, "His anointed heir and the presumptive nominee, Vice President Herbert Hoover, found himself manacled to the administration's grim war. Humphrey did not compete in the primaries. Instead, he owed his front-runner status entirely to the patronage of party bosses who controlled vast numbers of delegates. The anti-war activist arriving in Chicago saw the convention as a farce. The fix was in, quote, dump the hump, end quote, would be one of the milder chants, end quote. The Republicans had already chosen their guys, Nixon and Agnew. They had one goal in mind, and that was to win the White House at all costs. What I mean by that is scandal and surreptitious dealings. And that story is next. The Johnson administration had been engaged in preparatory negotiations with North Vietnam since April. By late October, the administration had worked out this really convoluted formula. It essentially indicated that the United States would declare a bombing halt with the comprehension that Hanoi would not utilize the situation by imposing more attacks on the cities in South Vietnam. On October 31st, President Lyndon B. Johnson sat up, cleared his throat, looked into the camera, and uttered these words.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. I speak to you this evening about very important developments in our search for peace in Vietnam. We have been engaged in discussions with the North Vietnamese in Paris since last May. The discussions began after I announced on the evening of March 31st in a television speech to the nation that the United States, in an effort to get talks started on a settlement of the Vietnam War, had stopped the bombing of North Vietnam in the area where 90% of the people live. When our representatives, Ambassador Harriman and Ambassador Vance, were sent to Paris, they were instructed to insist throughout the discussions that the legitimate elected government of South Vietnam must take its place in any serious negotiations affecting the future of South Vietnam. Therefore, our ambassadors, Harriman and Vance, made it abundantly clear to the representatives of North Vietnam in the beginning that, as I had indicated on the evening of March 31st, we would stop the bombing of North Vietnamese territory entirely when that would lead to prompt and productive talks. Meaning by that, talks in which the government of Vietnam was free to participate.
So that was President Johnson on October 31st, 1968, essentially talking about how far the two countries had come with the peace talks. This announcement was deliberately set up to benefit Hubert Humphrey's campaign. Well, that was until the whole thing fell apart. The South Vietnamese government had spontaneously made it noticeable it would not participate in the newly proposed negotiations, and it was all because of a woman named Anna Chennault, a Chinese-born hostess, a fundraiser for the Nixon campaign, and a grandee of the Chinese lobby. The day before Johnson made the announcement, he mumbled darkly about Chennault's activities while on the phone with Senator Richard Russell. The next day, Johnson announced the bombing halt, and that night, he was beside himself, expressing his infuriation about Nixon's actions in a telephone call with Illinois Republican Senator Edward Dirksen. Johnson said, quote, "It's despicable. We could stop killing out there, but they've got this new formula put in there, namely, wait on Nixon, and they're killing 400 or 500 every day waiting on Nixon," end quote. Anna Chennault had sabotaged the peace talks. Reportedly, she vehemently encouraged Saigon to be uncooperative, and they did just that. She told South Vietnam that if they had damaged Johnson's plan, the election would go to Nixon, who would propose to them better terms and a new peace agreement. She was the middlewoman orchestrating it all. What she didn't know was that the FBI was surveilling her. Chennault was also known as Little Flower, as a nickname. Here's what the FBI report read. Quote, Anna Chennault contacted Vietnam Ambassador Bu Dim and advised him that she had received a message from her boss, which her boss wanted to give her personally to the ambassador, end quote. Then she says in the message, quote, "Hold on, we are gonna win. Please tell your boss to hold on," end quote. What happened next in the story was shock and anger. Stick around. 'Cause 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 'c After President Johnson got his hands on those damning transcripts, he called Senator Edward Dirksen. This is their conversation.
I want to talk to you as a friend and very confidentially because I think that we're skirting on dangerous ground, and I thought I ought to give you the facts, and you ought to pass them on if you choose. If you don't, why, then I will a little later. Some of our folks, including some of the old China lobby, are going to the Vietnamese embassy and saying, please notify the president that if he'll hold out till November the 2nd, they could get a better deal. Now, I'm reading their hand, Everett. I don't want to get this in the campaign. That's right. And they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason. I know.
The election was now just a day away, and so on Monday, November 4th, LBJ held a conference call with 4 people: National Security Advisor Walt Rostow, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and the Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford. They were debating if they should divulge Nixon's reprehensible actions, but they felt as if they didn't have enough proof. And Nixon had denied any knowledge of this whatsoever on a November 3rd call with LBJ. In spite of that, Johnson's National Security Advisor, Walt Rostow, said, quote, blow the whistle, end quote. However, if Johnson was going to, quote, blow the whistle, that would mean exposing his administration's surveillance on a wartime ally and on Mrs. Chenault. So they decided not to divulge it and instead locked it up. According to a document released in 2008, Johnson's National Security Advisor wrote to the director of the LBJ Library. Here's what he said. Quote, after 50 years, the director of the LBJ Library should the administrative structure, or whomever may inherit his responsibilities, should the administrative structure of the National Archives change, may alone open this file, end quote. The file would have been opened in 2018, but instead it was opened 10 years earlier in 2008. We'll be right back. Richard Nixon had overwhelmingly won the election back in 1968. Here's an NBC News reporter projecting the winner.
That's the natural banner for any sprightly front page tonight. At almost midday Eastern Time, NBC News projected Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, when it became evident he had carried Illinois.
After that overwhelming victory, Nixon was sworn in as president on January 20th, 1969.
Mr. President, are you ready to take the constitutional oath? If you will place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand, and please repeat after me. I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
This was the beginning of a journey for a White House that would soon fall apart. I'm Jeremiah Patterson, and thank you for being with me today on Episode 1. We are gonna win. My sources for this episode are listed in the description. Join me next Tuesday for Episode 2. Stay safe and take care.